It's a year to the day since the October the 7th attacks, and faith leaders from the UK today published a joint letter saying, while we may hold different views about aspects of the conflict, we stand united in our grief and in our belief that our shared humanity must bring us together. United in grief. Shared humanity. This is hollow, meaningless language. It is liberal hand-wringing that creates a false equivalence between oppressor and oppressed. Shared humanity is devoid of meaning when that humanity is denied to Palestinians whose lives have been systematically devalued under decades of Israeli occupation. I am fed up with faith leaders, especially those within my own tradition like Justin Welby, using mealy-mouthed aphorisms, sentimentalities and equivocations to abrogate their responsibility to speak with moral clarity in the face of such blatant and ongoing injustice. Signing this letter alongside figures like Chief Rabbi Ephraim Mervis, who consistently and openly praises the IDF and the Israeli state for their actions in Gaza, shows faith leaders who are, at best, putting optics before justice and, at worst, showing active complicity in a genocide. You cannot claim to stand against hatred, division and violence whilst aligning yourself with those who perpetuate it. And this stuff filters down. I cannot count the number of times over the past year where I've been sat in church and had to maintain my decorum as someone impotently prays for peace on all sides, as if this is a conflict rather than a genocide. If not even our supposed leaders have the moral courage to stand for justice in a church service, how the hell are the rest of us supposed to do it everywhere else? Christianity was never meant to be about respectability, and one man who understood this was the late Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Now, earlier today I came across a reflection from Professor Sarojini Nadar, in which she used Tutu's 1986 speech at Stanford University to talk about neutral prayers. And I hope you'll stick with me, because it's worth it. She says, on neutral prayers for peace. On this day, the late Archbishop Desmond Tutu's birthday, and on the 1-year anniversary of the start of the genocide in Gaza, I'm reminded of his words spoken in a speech at Stanford University in January 1986.
In a situation of injustice and oppression, there can be no neutrality. You have to take sides. You have to say, am I on the side of justice or am I on the side of injustice? When an elephant is sitting on the tail of a mouse and you say, I am neutral, the mouse is not going to be particularly pleased about your neutrality. You have already made a decision. You have decided to be on the side of the powerful, of the elephant. There is no neutrality. You have already, in fact, made a choice.
Professor Nadar continues, I'm seeing various calls for prayers for peace and for the return of hostages, alongside prayers for Gaza. Of course, hostages must be returned, safely. But these neutral prayers for peace belie a disingenuous pretense that somehow the return of Israeli hostages will undo the decades of trauma, suffering and violence against the Palestinian people. As if the ongoing hostage-taking of the Palestinian people, who have been trapped in the world's largest open-air prison, will disappear once the hostages from October the 7th are returned. I think we need to pause and ask, what are we doing when we offer such neutral prayers? The late Archbishop Tutu began every meeting he held, whether it was with journalists or heads of states, with prayer. Today, when I read these neutral prayers for peace, and I recall his radical theology for justice, I wonder if we could consider the following. 1. Peace is not the absence of war, but the presence of justice. To paraphrase Martin Luther King Jr., peace is not the absence of war, but the presence of justice. Neutral prayers imply that peace can come simply from ending violence on both sides, but peace without justice is an illusion. True peace requires the dismantling of the structures of violence, such as the Israeli occupation of Palestine. Just as Archbishop Tutu and liberation theologians in South Africa called for the end of apartheid as a condition for peace, we must demand justice for Palestinians as the foundation for peace. Justice and peace are inseparable. 2. Neutrality upholds the oppressor's power. When we pray equally for the occupier and the occupied, we are ironically choosing a side, the side of the oppressor. Neutral prayers silence the specificity of Palestinian suffering and uphold the power dynamics of apartheid. In South Africa, black liberation theologians did not confuse the violence of white supremacy with the righteous struggle for liberation. They named the oppressor and the oppressed. To pray equally for both the machinery of occupation and those struggling under its boot is to erase the very real and genocidal violence being enacted on Palestinians. 3. False moral equivalence perpetuates injustice. Neutral prayers suggest a moral equivalence between the violence of the occupier and the suffering of the occupied. This both sides rhetoric, reminiscent of apartheid church theology, as the Kairos document labelled it, obscures the disproportionate power and violence against Palestinians. It implies that the suffering is mutual when, in reality, the scales of violence are tipped overwhelmingly against the Palestinian people. Peace cannot be achieved through a false equivalence that perpetuates systemic injustice. We must reject the all lives matter rhetoric in this context, not because we don't believe that all lives matter, but because Palestinian lives, like black South African lives, have not mattered equally, and because such a claim neutralises the specificity of Palestinian suffering under a brutal and ongoing genocide. 4. True peace requires naming and dismantling apartheid. Just as black liberation theology in South Africa named apartheid for what it was, true peace today requires overtly naming the Israeli occupation as an apartheid system and standing firmly against it. Praying for peace while ignoring the apartheid system that fuels the violence is not just ineffective, it is complicit. Tutu's legacy reminds us that real peace begins with justice, with the end of occupation, the return of stolen land, and the dismantling of the apparatus of apartheid. 5. Radical solidarity, not neutrality, is the path to justice. In moments of extreme inequality, neutrality is not an option. We must take a stance of radical solidarity with the oppressed. This is why Tutu did not hold back from supporting the Boycott, Divestment and Sanctions (BDS) movement against both South African and Israeli apartheid as a sign of solidarity, because he understood the need for concrete action against oppression. Neutral prayers buy into the rhetoric of sending thoughts and prayers without actually taking any further radical actions of solidarity with those who fight against injustice. 6. Neutral prayers silence the cry for liberation. To pray neutrally is not simply to passively amplify a call to peace, it is to actively silence the call for liberation. Tutu's words remind us that both silence and neutrality in situations of injustice is a form of complicity. If we are serious about peace, we must stop offering neutral prayers and instead work toward justice for the Palestinian people, just as we did for black South Africans. 7. An alternative to neutral prayers, praying with intention. What is the alternative? In our prayers, we must, of course, hold space for the humanity of both the oppressed and the oppressor, but we have to do so recognising that the suffering, while both deeply felt, is rooted in fundamentally and radically different realities. We should pray not to conflate their experiences, as neutral prayers do, but to acknowledge the supremacy that underpins oppression and fuels injustice in the hearts and minds of those who wield power, especially those in the West who send arms to Israel. Our prayers must call for an end to this supremacist thinking, seeking transformation for the oppressor, while praying for strength and resilience in those who resist the colonial and brutal occupation, for it is often within this struggle that their humanity is at stake. Instead of offering neutral prayers that obscure the specific contexts of suffering, we should pray with intention, asking for liberation for the oppressed and for the courage to confront and dismantle the systems of violence that perpetuate inequality. This loving and justice-oriented approach compels us to seek not only peace, but a transformative justice that uplifts the marginalised and challenges the structures that bind us all. In memory of our beloved Arch, Salam, Shalom, Shanti.